Options.
For the freedom of man.
Let us turn now to the fundamentals.
Your victory. We have never seen a greater day than this. Not this ago.
The 20th century's great powers collided from time to time with devastatingly bloody results, but more frequently, they battled it out in the far-flung corners of their colonial empires. These distant outposts had for centuries provided the resources that helped to maintain those very empires. By the 20th century, powerful forces came into play, which began to challenge the very assumptions on which these empires had been built. But colonialism was a system that was deeply entrenched around the world. It would often take an individual with unique abilities to not only rally his people to the cause, but to confront a seemingly invincible enemy. In a relatively unknown part of Asia called Vietnam, a revolutionary known as Ho Chi Minh placed himself squarely on the forefront of the battle between colonialism and self-determination. His leadership against Japan, France, and the United States prompted Time magazine to name him one of the most influential people of the century. By the time of his death, few people in the West knew anything about this man, whose name can most closely be translated as one who aspires to the light. To glimpse into the reality of Ho Chi Minh's life is to try and circumvent the propaganda not only of the Vietnamese regime, but also the long campaign to discredit him in the West. Who was the real Ho Chi Minh? How did he lead his people as they threw off the yoke of their French colonial masters? And how did he create a military operation which would not only hand the United States of America a devastating defeat, but would sow the seeds for Vietnamese independence from colonial rule? The name Ho Chi Minh was only the last in a long series of names taken by a man born Nguyen Van Than. He came into the world on May 19, 1890, in a straw hut at the edge of a tiny village in Vietnam.
His original name was given to him by parents of the burgeoning anti-colonial movement, Nguyen Van Thuong. Translated, it means he who will be victorious, so it was sort of prophetic. Even when he was a little boy, his father had him running as a special courier for the revolution, and his sister was thrown into jail for life for stealing weapons from the French barracks. So he really was born into a culture of revolution. Now his father realized that if you were going to understand your enemy, you had to know him. So he sent all of his sons to the elite French colonial school.
Ho Chi Minh was exposed to the French revolutionary doctrine of liberté, égalité, and fraternité in his textbooks. Although inspired by the basic message, he was disturbed by the hypocrisy of the oppressive colonialist France and began to lecture his fellow students on the injustice of it. The authorities quickly removed him from the institution. He found work as a cook on a French steamship liner.
While stopping in all the cities of the French Empire, he began to realize that Vietnam was only one of many countries that were being exploited around the world. And the more he learned about French history, especially their revolution, the angrier he got at the brutality of their regime in Indochina and elsewhere.
He worked in low-paying jobs in Paris, London, and New York. He carefully studied the culture and the politics of these Western democracies. Although he was generally impressed with how the U.S. was run, he was appalled by the treatment of the black population by the whites. He rallied fellow Asians to demand better pay and working conditions. Impressed by his political activism, he was invited into socialist groups by the activist leaders. He began to learn about Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin.
At first, he couldn't quite grasp the complex writings of these communist theorists, and he had to reread them many, many times. When these new ideas finally crystallized for him, he actually wept with joy. This is the answer, he said. Communism is the answer to the national liberation of the Vietnamese people, who have been exploited and occupied for thousands of years.
His ever-deepening involvement with communist groups in Paris caused the authorities to keep a file on him. They noted that in 1924 he visited Moscow and had written to his friends that it was the duty of all communists to return to their countries, make contact with the masses, train them, and lead them in their fight for freedom and independence. He knew that if he returned to Vietnam, he would be arrested and thrown in jail like his sister. Instead, he moved to China, just north of the border. He gathered exiled Vietnamese nationalists and created the Vietnam Revolutionary League.
He trained his followers to infiltrate the Vietnamese mines, farms, and factories in order to spread the word. So when World War II arrived and the Japanese army occupied Vietnam, China was only too happy to give Ho Chi Minh support and funds in order to lead his new resistance movement, the Viet Minh. And after Pearl Harbor, even the Americans were willing to back him. He actually kissed the ground when he re-entered Vietnam, this time as a liberator.
He finally adopts the name Ho Chi Minh and leads a successful guerrilla campaign against the Japanese occupation army. He learns hard but valuable lessons of warfare, which would prove vitally important in the decades ahead.
He becomes a national hero, and by the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he is very popular. Even the Emperor Bao Dai abdicates in order to make room for him and his party. But it starts to become clear that once again, the West will support French claims to Indo-Chinese rule. Ho Chi Minh has to make his move. So on September 2nd, 1945, he delivers his famous Vietnamese Declaration of Independence.
Ho Chi Minh was a very small and sickly-looking man, having struggled with tuberculosis. Far from appearing as a heroic warrior, he was the picture of a wise and humble old uncle.
He was calm and deliberate, and he started out by reminding the very international powers who wanted to reoccupy his country of their own revolutionary roots.
All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free. The Declaration of the French Revolution, made in 1791 on the rights of man and the citizen, also states, all men are born free and with equal rights, and must always remain free and have equal rights. Those are undeniable truths.
This was the perfect opening. Not only does it have a massive resonance within his immediate audience, but if there are any Americans or French listening, they recognize these words.
Ho Chi Minh then compares these ideals of freedom, justice, and global equality with the French policies toward Indochina. Nevertheless, for more than 80 years, the French imperialists, abusing the standard of liberty, equality, and fraternity, have violated our fatherland and oppressed our fellow citizens. They have acted contrary to the ideals of humanity and justice. In the field of politics, they have deprived our people of every democratic liberty. They have built more prisons than schools. They have mercilessly slain our patriots. They have robbed us of our rice fields, our mines, our forests, and our raw materials. More than 2 million of our fellow citizens died from starvation.
He spells out what he sees as the moral differences between the Viet Minh and the French. It's propaganda, but it's effective propaganda.
The French colonialists so intensified their terrorist activities against the Viet Minh members that before fleeing they massacred a great number of our political prisoners detained at Yen Bay and Cao Bang. Notwithstanding all this, our fellow citizens have always manifested toward the French a tolerant and humane attitude. Even after the Japanese Putsch of March 1945, the Viet Minh League helped many Frenchmen to cross the frontier, rescued some of them from Japanese jails, and protected French lives and property.
He concludes with the case for the liberation of Vietnam.
We, members of the Provisional Government, representing the whole Vietnamese people, declare that from now on we break off all relations of a colonial character with France, and we abolish all the special rights the French have unlawfully acquired in our fatherland. The whole Vietnamese people, animated by a common purpose, are determined to fight to the bitter end against any attempt by the French colonialists to reconquer their country. We solemnly declare to the world that Vietnam has the right to be a free and independent country, and in fact it is so already. France, to no one's surprise, refused to recognize Vietnamese independence. The power of financial interests in the area vastly outweighed romantic notions of freedom and justice among the Asian people. With help from the American and British military, they moved to reclaim the country.
But the elections were held, and Ho Chi Minh and his party won decisively in the North and in the South. They believed in the man, they believed in the movement.
In 1946, he called on the people of North and South Vietnam to wipe out the French and defeat the U.S. military advisors who had come to support them. Having just finished with the invading Japanese, Vietnam would plunge once again into all-out war. Having their pleas for independence ignored by the world body, Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people were forced once again into war, this time against the French. The excuse of Cold War communist aggression was used to mask the interest of the Western powers in the raw materials and strategic positioning that Vietnam supplied for them. America, supportive of Ho Chi Minh against the Japanese, was now supporting France against the Vietnamese.
It was the height of the Cold War, and American fear of international communism had reached fever pitch. It was easy for them to forget that Ho Chi Minh, like Stalin, had helped to defeat the Axis powers.
The military struggle in the first 5 years seemed unwinnable for Ho Chi Minh and General Giap. But in 1949, China provided a safe haven just north of the border to bring wounded and trained troops. While the French had an iron grip on the south, the Viet Minh gained control over more and more of the north. The French installed the former Emperor Bo Dai as official head of state.
And now that the French government realized that this was going to be a long, ugly war, they began to have second thoughts. And they had lost almost 100,000 men in Vietnam since 1946. They proposed a peace plan. They offered to set up a national government and eventually to grant Vietnam total independence.
Ho Chi Minh did not trust the French offer. They vowed to continue the fight until the French pulled out unconditionally. More and more of the French public were not only growing weary of the bloody war, but they were beginning to doubt the moral justification of France's presence in Indochina at all. Although the U.S. was supporting half the costs of the French military under the anti-communist Marshall Plan, the remaining financial burden of the struggle was astronomical.
The French commander in Vietnam was General Navarre, and he needed a master stroke. In order to deliver a knockout blow to Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, he would need a set-piece battle, rather than continue to suffer from the guerrilla attacks that had so effectively worn down his troops. He set up a massive defensive warren at Dien Bien Phu, which was along a critically important Viet Minh route for supplies and manpower from Laos. The French knew that General Giap would pull out all the stops to take it back.
But Ho Chi Minh saw the trap, and they prepared for what would become one of the defining battles of the 20th century. They secretly brought up 70,000 troops from all over the country, and they surrounded the French defensive position, outnumbering them 5-1. But more importantly, they brought new artillery and anti-aircraft weaponry into the hills. This was done with hard labor. Guns were taken apart and hauled up the muddy slopes. The French had no idea that this level of large-caliber weaponry could be deployed from these hilltops.
The French were caught by surprise. The Vietnamese army punished them for 2 solid months. Resupply for the French was practically impossible due to anti-aircraft guns and the artillery.
The French commander pulled the pin on his own grenade and killed himself. 7,000 French soldiers were killed, and another 10,000 were taken prisoner. The knockout blow had backfired. The French surrendered and announced total withdrawal from Vietnam. An emergency meeting was held by the superpowers. They agreed to grant Ho Chi Minh the control of the North, while placing an anti-communist puppet in control of the South, and promising nationwide elections by 1956.
The truth is that the U.S. was buying time. Even President Eisenhower admitted that if there were a vote, 80% of the people would vote for Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party. There never was a plan by the West to allow this to happen, but for the moment, Ho Chi Minh was delighted that France was leaving.
But when the United States propped up leader of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, refused to hold the promised elections, the communists decided that violence might convince him to reconsider. Thousands of southern Vietnamese people retreated to the jungles and formed militias. Lacking the strength to wage all-out civil war, they concentrated on killing Diem officials, 1,200 of them.
In the beginning, Ho Chi Minh demanded that this violence be stopped. He instructed his leaders in the South to consolidate political support rather than engage in terrorism. But Diem simply imprisoned political leaders, so Ho Chi Minh decided to support the armed groups and their tactics.
This broad organization of armed resistance became known as the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, or Viet Cong. Under a loose umbrella, they operated in groups of only 3 or 5, deliberately operating without knowledge of other cells. That way, when captured and tortured by Diem's agents, they could not divulge information about the other cells' operations.
They were given a strict code of conduct to respect peasant lives and property, for Mao Zedong had always said, without the support of the peasants, the revolution is doomed.
Ho Chi Minh's rules included helping the workers with their work as much as possible, never lying to the people even in the context of an operation, never buying or borrowing what they could not sell or lend, and holding as paramount that the people were the backbone of the movement.
Diem found Ho Chi Minh's popularity disturbing. He took drastic measures to prevent people from being influenced by his agents. He herded villagers behind bamboo stockades and forced them to work in protected hamlets, which were little more than work camps.
President John F. Kennedy was alarmed to learn that this strategic hamlet program had actually caused membership in the Viet Cong to triple to almost 20,000. More and more American military advisors were sent in an attempt to reverse the trend. But the villagers saw the Viet Cong as their defenders and the Americans as the attackers. This was made much worse by the policy of the Americans to torture villagers about Viet Cong activities and apply collective punishment to villages suspected of collaborating with them.
The Viet Cong continued to emerge as a military force, practicing highly effective guerrilla warfare against the Southern Army. They controlled significant areas of farmland, which they gave back to the people.
Ho Chi Minh had led the defeat of the French, and now the organizations which he had helped to create were causing growing frustration for the Americans. Faced with the prospect of a humiliating and destabilizing defeat, Kennedy withdrew his CIA protection of Diem, and he was overthrown and murdered. The Viet Cong efforts intensified.
So Kennedy had begun to talk, both privately and publicly, about withdrawal from Vietnam. But of course he was assassinated in November of 1963. Lyndon Johnson succeeds him, and he decides that he's going to solve the South Vietnamese problem by bombing the North Vietnamese back into the Stone Age. The Americans call these daily bombing raids Operation Rolling Thunder.
Ho Chi Minh concentrated more and more on creating a viable communist state in the North. His age and frailty caused him to be removed more and more from the actual operations in the South. As they endured the savage bombing, they looked to Ho Chi Minh as an inspirational figurehead more than anything else. He was considered the most important Vietnamese hero in 2,000 years.
The French and the Americans had strong motivation to vilify this man. That was in part because they viewed his actions through the lens of colonialism and later anti-communism. What they really failed to grasp was that his struggle was for national liberation.
The American military effort on the peninsula grew significantly. As the war intensified, Ho Chi Minh's health grew worse. In September of 1969, he died of a heart attack. All of Vietnam agreed to a 3-day ceasefire in his memory.
He did not live to see his dream of an independent Vietnam come true. Neither did the millions of Vietnamese or 60,000 Americans killed by the time the war ended some 6 years later. The Americans offered him diplomatic choices to end the fighting, but he chose to stick to his guns and settle for nothing less than a unified Vietnam. When his troops finally swept into Saigon, they renamed the city in his honor.
Ho Chi Minh's last wishes were ignored by those who wanted to use his image to forward the continuing struggle. They displayed his embalmed corpse in a huge mausoleum rather than the simple cremation he had requested.